Where did the slideshow viewer go? Play from the start. Continue to share. Can you see that?
Yes.
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 Yep.
All right. So I'm here to talk to you today about extra support in our Gateway math courses. Thank you all for coming. I know those of you in the math department have heard a bit of this already. I did talk to the department on this topic in December, so I'll try to avoid being too repetitive while also making sure to introduce the topic so that those of you who aren't from the department are able to follow along. So basically what I'll be saying are first, what do I even mean by Gateway math courses? Then I'll describe a pilot that we started in fall 2021 to increase student success in these courses. Then I'll talk about some of the student outcomes. So we're just now at the point where this first cohort, many of them were graduating this month. Then I'll talk about how the project has changed a bit, what it looks like in its current implementation. And then I'll look at our most recent data of our outcomes from the students in fall 2024. And I just realized I again can't see my clock. Okay. So when I talk about Gateway math courses, what I mean are courses that may be a student's first college math course and that are intended to lead to other math courses. So my focus is typically on the calculus gateway courses that are leading to calculus and then potentially beyond. So intermediate algebra, college algebra, pre-calculus, and then calculus 1. That pathway does also branch off in another direction for the business students. They may take intermediate algebra, college algebra, and then business math. And students can start anywhere along this sequence. They don't necessarily start at intermediate algebra. They take a placement test that will tell them what's the most appropriate course for them. But the important point is that these are not general education courses, so they're not courses that students will take just because they need to take one math course and be done with it. They're taking these courses because they want to continue on into future math courses that are required for their major. And the success rate in these courses has typically been fairly low, especially when we look at them as a gateway. So when we had a math placement ad hoc committee in fall 2019, we got some data from institutional research that looked at the past 10 years and found that only 6% of students who enrolled in intermediate algebra later enrolled in Calculus 1. So as a gateway, the course was not really starting the students on their path in the way that we hoped. And so the project that I was undertaking was to try to improve these outcomes a little bit. And I say that I was undertaking, so I specifically was working on an initiative related to the intermediate algebra and college algebra students, but the department as a whole has other initiatives. There's a similar one going on for pre-calculus that started at the same time as the one I'll be talking about. And there's also a newer initiative this past spring, where they had extra support in their calculus courses. So I'll just be focusing on the one aspect of it, but it's part of a much broader project. So the original pilot was using what I'll call a co-requisite remediation model. I've moved away from that language more recently, but basically research found that students were not making progress if they were starting way back in a prerequisite course that in many cases was not even credit bearing. Intermediate algebra recently or relatively recently switched from being a non-credit to a credit bearing course. The research found that students were more successful if instead they started in a slightly higher level course, but were given extra support in order to fill in any gaps in their knowledge. And already as I'm talking about this, you can see the sort of deficit model that's inherent in this language, which is one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of it. Remediation is suggesting, there's some problem, whereas extra support is a more positive framing and it gets at the broader range of what we can do with these extra courses. But the basic model was we had an extra support section that met for an extra 80 minutes each week. It had a lower course cap than usual, only 19 students, so they could get more support from the instructor. The enrollment was initially restricted to first-year STEM majors, so we were being very deliberate about targeting the group who would be trying to go on to Calculus 1. And it was for students whose ALEKS placement score fell slightly below the cutoff. so 38 to 45 rather than 46 to 60 for college algebra. So it's a very, very specific group of students, which led to some challenges. But we did eventually get a class made up of those students. In later implementations, we were a bit more flexible with the criteria so that other students could enroll in the course as well. Why is it not letting me click forward? So in the end, in the first cohort, we had 13 first-year STEM majors who we had been aiming to have in the course. Then about a month into enrollment, we opened it up to also business majors who again might be taking the course as they head towards business math. We also had one new transfer who was a STEM major, and we also allowed one student who had previously failed college algebra to retake the course in the extra support section. So those were the students we had. And the outcomes, at least in terms of the later math courses, were promising. So we took students who typically would have been placed in intermediate algebra, and we saw that historically only 6% of those students even went on to take Calculus 1 at all. But in this case, half of the class went on to pass pre-calculus, and 7 of those, 39%, did go on to pass Calculus 1. The numbers are so dramatic that I want to emphasize it's not just about the impact of the extra support section. The students were carefully selected to be the ones, first of all, the half of the students who actually are heading towards Calculus 1, and then the top half of the class of those students. But still, I think it made a really important point that we shouldn't give up on these students just because they placed into a lower level course. They are still capable with extra support of getting through the course that they need. And so Calculus 1 is typically a requirement of most STEM majors. So by saying that we're getting these students to Calculus 1 and not just getting there, but getting through Calculus 1, we're saying that STEM majors are an option for these students. So they can graduate in STEM majors. And this is the actual graduation outcomes of those students. So now that 4 years have passed, we can look back and see that a few of them actually are graduating in STEM majors that required Calculus 1. So one of them, the transfer student, is the only one who had actually graduated already in computer science that requires calculus. There's another student who graduated in applied mathematical economics with a minor in applied statistics. So he also took math courses beyond Calculus 1. The zoology major, again, that major requires Calculus 1. And biology, they don't need Calculus 1, but that student did take Calculus 1 as an optional course in that major. So it may seem still like only a small number of the students actually graduating, but the graduation outcomes are much more positive than you would expect for the students in this cohort. And so I think that's an encouraging sign. But so moving ahead 4 years to what we are doing now, we have streamlined the implementation a lot. In the fall, we ran 2 extra support sections of college algebra. Again, they meet for an extra 80 minutes each week. We also had 2 extra support sections of pre-calculus. And again, we're trying to be flexible in terms of making it as easy as possible for advisors to get students into these courses. So instead of saying it's restricted to STEM majors, these sections are open to all students, regardless of their major. That just makes it a lot easier for everyone, and we don't have the pressure of thinking, will we get enough students, the right students? Just any students who need to be taking that course can take that section of it. And so it's also not just restricted to students who have a very narrow range of placement scores slightly below the cutoff. Those students are still allowed to enroll in this extra support class, but also students who qualify for the regular sections and just would benefit from extra support can also enroll in the extra support classes. So again, if you're coming at it as an advisor, you don't have to think, is it the student allowed to take this course? If the student is allowed to take regular college algebra, they can take college algebra with extra support. So that hopefully makes things a bit easier for everyone. Here I just put the placement scores for Alex that would place you into either college algebra or pre-calculus. So regularly, students with scores from 46 to 60 would take college algebra, and that upper limit is not a hard cutoff. Students can also enroll in a lower level course than their placement score would allow, but typically if they got a placement score above 60, they would be enrolling in the next course up and less commonly going back to college algebra. So the extra support section still includes all those students in the 46 to 60 range, but it also goes a little bit lower into students in the upper half of the range that would normally place into intermediate algebra. And same thing with pre-calculus, the regular sections have a placement score of 61 to 75. And again, if you placed into calculus, you could still choose to go back. So the 75 is not a hard cutoff. But for the extra support section, again, students in the upper end of that college algebra range could take the pre-calculus section with extra support. So then one of the most interesting or important questions is what happens during the extra time? And this is something that I think would be nice if our department could actually take a whole hour sometime to discuss what we're doing with our extra time and why, because many of us have different approaches. So the first thing that does come up is review of prerequisite material. And that's what the initial idea of the co-requisite support model was. It was that we could fill in gaps in students' knowledge by reviewing that material during class time. So that is definitely still an aspect of what we do here, but it's only one thing. It also gives us more class time for challenging topics. So typically there's so much material in these courses that one topic gets one day and then we have to move on, even if it's a topic that's relatively long and complicated. So for example, solving quadratic inequalities is just such a time-consuming process for the students that I've found they benefit from spending a bit of a second day on it. And that's just not an option in the regular class. Another really essential thing is more class time for connecting and comparing different topics. So again, we typically have time for one topic each class, and they might be doing different types of equations, linear equations one day, quadratic equations a couple of days, absolute value equations. And then they're doing inequalities, linear inequalities, quadratic inequalities, absolute value inequalities. And when they're introduced to each thing in isolation, that's fine. But then we have a quiz and they realize they're not distinguishing among the different types very effectively. So it's helpful to have a separate class day just to go over and really highlight these are the differences between these different techniques that you've learned. This is how you tell which technique you should use in which situation. So sort of doing the bigger picture work that they might not see as we just do each topic on a different day. There's class time for connecting to the online homework system. This is one day, but I think it's an extremely important day and something that, again, there's not time for in the regular sections. So I try to give students as explicit instructions as I can to say, you know, try to connect at home. But then when I have them bring in their computers, they're finding that they have all sorts of different issues with red shelf or issues with pop-ups, all of these things. And just having the time to troubleshoot all of those issues right there in class makes a huge difference in whether the students are ready to get started right from the first day or the second day, or whether they're getting lost and suddenly they're 2 weeks behind and haven't started any homework at all. So it's the same reasons that make inclusive access really helpful, that students have access to materials from day one. Well, that's only true if they actually can access the materials that they're paying for. Class time for test review, another thing that students always want and appreciate, but that we typically don't have time for. Class time for starting on test corrections. This one is obviously specific to whether you're allowing them to do test corrections, but I find it's one of the peak learning days because they're extremely motivated to learn this material that they missed. They just got their test back, so they want to immediately look at it and because they can get some amount of credit, I only give them a third of the credit back for their corrections, but they immediately want to do the corrections, and then they have me right there to get help with any questions that they're struggling with. So on the next slide, I'll talk a bit about deliberate practice and why that is effective. But doing these test corrections in class is really some of the most deliberate practice they can do with this material. Then new this fall 2025, we'll also be adding in some booster sessions on student skills. This is an idea that Amy had, so I'm sorry Amy couldn't be here today. But basically 5 or 6 times during the semester, she'll come in and teach them something like how to navigate a syllabus, or how do you set up a Google Calendar that shows, all of your instructors' office hours, your test dates, everything, all of the key information for your courses. So just very concrete things, but the sort of skills that help them navigate college more effectively. Because as you may have seen as I went down this list, it's really not just that students are missing certain background knowledge, it's sort of putting together all of the pieces into how to be an effective college student. And the last thing that I listed here is relationship building. So we've had at least several of the book groups we've done have talked about how essential relationships are. And so seeing the students an extra day each week, but also having a bit more flexibility in the class time really makes it possible for the students to get to know their instructors and hopefully also the other students that much better. So they have a more supportive system around them. So I want to really highlight this one aspect of making time for deliberate practice. There was a quote in our reading group last fall that said, meaningful reductions in achievement gaps only occur when course designs combine deliberate practice with inclusive teaching. And they were helpfully very specific about what we mean by deliberate practice. So extensive and highly focused efforts geared toward improving performance, meaning students work hard on relevant tasks. So that's exactly what I was thinking, the test corrections are what they need to do. It's highly focused. They're looking at exactly what they got wrong. They're working hard at it because they know they'll get some credit for it in a relatively high stakes assessment. Scaffolded exercises designed to address specific deficits in understanding or skills. That's sort of the prerequisite remediation aspect of it, where we can fill in gaps in their knowledge as they come up. Immediate feedback. So a lot of the things that I am saying here, like doing practice on prerequisite material, we might think the students could just do this as homework. We assign homework and they do it. There are a lot of issues with that. First of all, students have so much else going on in their lives that they may not even have as much time for homework as we ideally would like them to have. But also doing the work with the instructor right there when they're just learning a new topic means they can really get started on it. So do some questions, get a bit of feedback, and then go from there. And repetition, again, like I was saying, sometimes you need 2 days for a challenging topic just because they haven't quite processed it all yet. So having the time to come back really helps with that aspect as well. So I think having this extra time and using it for deliberate practice is one of the most powerful things we can do here. So then some actual data about the college algebra student outcomes. So we give a common final exam across all sections, graded out of 200 points. And this fall, the 2 extra support sections, which had some students with lower placement scores, actually did better on the common final than the 2 regular sections. So even though the students were theoretically less prepared going in, by the time they had the extra practice, and also I want to say, Teresa, the 840 section had an embedded tutor as well, so that definitely also can make an impact. But with the right support, the students in these theoretically less prepared sections were able to get better results on the final than the students in the standard sections. And then looking at the very newest data of did they then go on to succeed in pre-calculus, there's a lot of variation in these numbers because, again, some students are never intending to go to pre-calculus, half of the students roughly might be going towards business math instead, and how that happens to break down can vary a lot from course to course. But basically, the numbers from the extra support and regular sections are about the same in terms of the students going on to succeed in pre-calculus. And even a bunch of those theoretically less prepared students were going on to succeed in pre-calculus in the following spring. So last slide, some takeaways. Students who place into our lowest credit-bearing math courses are still capable of graduating with a STEM major. So that's one of the most important things, that we shouldn't just discount them from the beginning. With extra support, students with lower placement scores can match or even surpass the performance of students with higher placement scores. And the last thing is that students who do meet the standard prerequisites for our courses could also benefit from extra support. So I'd like to see us extending the extra support model to more of our courses to help more of our students thrive. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Any questions?
I was just wondering, as far as, when it comes to advising students to take a course based upon their placement exam, how often is it that the students are advised to, sometimes take a course that's actually lower than what their placement exam score dictates it should be? Because I find sometimes students, like you said, they have trouble getting used to the college format, the getting signed in, getting used to everything. Sometimes it helps to have a course that, to start off with something that's a little bit lower than yours, so they can get used to the college lifestyle before they start having to worry about also getting used to the college material. Is that something that's pushed a lot, or do students take that advice?
I think it's a hard sell in the first semester. I can't really speak to the advisors, but I would say I've had more success talking to students who failed or did poorly and saying, I'd really recommend you step back, but they typically need to see it for themselves at the end of the semester versus being willing to take a lower course from the outset. I'd be curious to hear from Paul about what happens with students on academic probation, and are there any ways to force them to take a lower course, or is that not part of the academic probation advisement process?
Well, before Paul speaks, I'd just like to say a couple of things. So, Zoe, I'm glad you pointed out that this is all part of a bigger project, sort of, that the math department has undertaken. And it's been several years in the making, as Zoe was pointing out. And it's not just math working on its own. We've also had tutoring as a very willing, and, they're constantly trying to change, just as we are in the math department. So it's been like multiple agencies that are at work with the same intention, to get students through the courses that they are taking. And so all of it is part of a very deliberate strategy that, math people are, and I include the OLS staff and in that categorization as well, that we have all been trying to get students through the courses that they're taking. And I know we haven't had a lot of success in the past, and people will tell us that it's really, really hard to do. I know Ramin isn't here, and he would attest to that as well, that, it's been a really hard job for us to get students through those. And we are kind of doing it almost one student at a time. We do this.
Absolutely.
Hey, Paul, do you want a quick response? We've got to cut it fairly short.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't dictate to students the course that they take. We can give them the data to allow them to come to the decision rationally. It would be great if you could talk to the advisors in the advisement center and give them the data, so that when they're dealing with the students coming in, they can say, well, I realize that you want to take this because it seems like the fast road to completion, but here's some data that show that if you do it this other way, you're actually going to complete, rather than spin your wheels withdrawing from pre-calc and failing calc and doing the sequence of things that we see so many students do.
And Paul, that's the latest initiative that we have started now, talking to advisement. So just in the last couple of weeks, we had a meeting with them where we actually shared some of the struggles that we have had with students when they already come into the wrong course, so to speak.
I think that there are going to be students who will be recalcitrant, and you can't plan for them, but you can bombard the students who might be amenable with data and show them that, yeah, this actually works. It might be that you can succeed going straight into Calc 2, good luck. But if you give them the data, they at least have the ability to make an informed decision.
Mm-hmm. And for the students who aren't willing to step back, I think that's where these extra support classes can really help, because then it's not a choice of, do I take pre-calculus or do I go back to college algebra? But maybe I really want to take pre-calculus, but I'll take it with the extra hour extra 80 minutes each week, so I can get some additional help while still maintaining the pace I want through my degree.
Okay, we're going to have to stop this session so we can get the video rendered and start the next one. But thank you.
Right, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Bye.